In the final days of World War II, life on the island of Okinawa had become a series of anxious pauses. The sound of distant artillery and the sight of smoke on the horizon were familiar, and yet they did little to prepare the villagers for the horrors of war. For Akiyo Tanaka, a mother living in a small, quiet village, the conflict was no longer something she simply feared. It had become a presence that loomed over her every waking moment. Her thoughts were consumed by the war's impact on her family, particularly her son, Hiro. Akiyo's husband had been conscripted into the army years before, and she had learned to live without him. But Hiro, her 12-year-old boy, had been taken by the Japanese military just a few months prior, sent to the front lines to fight in a war that seemed endless. Since his departure, Akiyo had heard nothing about his fate. The letters she sent were returned, unopened, and the village had grown too quiet for comfort. Despite her fears, Akiyo's heart clung to the hope that her son was alive. She had spent countless nights praying to the gods for Hiro's safety, wishing for his return, even as the odds seemed more and more impossible. Yet, there was a part of her that clung to the belief that a mother's love could transcend even the chaos of war. The community's radios had broadcasted the relentless advance of the American forces, and the inevitable fall of Okinawa seemed like a grim certainty. But Akiyo refused to succumb to despair. Every day, she kept a vigil, hoping against reason that Hiro would find his way back to her. She knew of the risks soldiers faced, the unrelenting violence of the battlefields, and the civilian casualties that had already claimed so many lives. Yet, in her mind, Hiro was different. He had to be different. The thought of her child dying alone on some foreign battlefield was unbearable. Akiyo would do anything to bring him home, even if it meant risking her own life to search for him. As the days passed, whispers of surrender spread through the village. The old men, who once spoke of the glory of fighting for their emperor, now exchanged uncertain glances. The children were taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and the notion of surviving the war seemed like an act of betrayal. In every corner of the village, the notion of death over surrender had taken root. But for Akiyo, the idea of living without her son was a torment she couldn't face. She had to believe he was alive. She had to hope. The soldiers had warned the villagers that any attempt to escape or show signs of weakness would be met with severe punishment. There were rumors that anyone trying to run would be shot on sight by their own forces. But Akiyo felt powerless against the overwhelming tide of fear and uncertainty that gripped her. All she could do was wait and pray that her son might return to her. As the arrival of the American forces grew closer, the villagers began to prepare for the worst. They were told to hide in their homes, to cover their windows, and to brace for the unimaginable. The old men sharpened their knives, and the women began to make the bitter decision of whether to end their own lives or the lives of their children to avoid the humiliation of capture. Akiyo, too, wondered if she should be preparing for the same. Yet, in the deepest corners of her heart, she could not give up. She could not abandon the small thread of hope that Hiro would come back. Akiyo's days blurred together in a haze of dread and hope. Each morning she woke thinking that perhaps today would be the day that Hiro would return to her arms. She looked out over the village, searching the horizon for any sign of him. Yet each time there was nothing but the distant echo of artillery, the rumbling of a war that was slowly swallowing her world. She felt as though the war was not only taking her son, but everything else, piece by piece. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant explosion. The earth trembled beneath her feet. She stiffened, her heart racing. She knew the Americans were close. The news had spread like wildfire across the island. The waiting game was over. Akiyo took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. In that moment, she didn't know whether she felt more fear or hope, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't give up now. Hiro needed her to keep believing. The sounds of war had been slowly creeping closer to the village, and every passing day felt like an eternity. As the American forces advanced, fear tightened its grip on the villagers of Okinawa. They had been told for years that the enemy was coming, but no amount of warnings or preparation could ease the terror that settled in when the actual rumblings of tanks and explosions reverberated through the land. For Akiyo, the arrival of the enemy was no longer a distant threat, it was now a terrifying reality. The village, once full of life, had become a ghost town, with families huddling together in their homes, afraid to venture out. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the occasional hurried footsteps of someone seeking shelter or the distant crackle of gunfire. Akiyo had never seen her community so silent. Even the children, once playful and carefree, had learned to keep their distance from the windows. It was as though the very air was filled with dread, a palpable weight that pressed on the chest and made breathing difficult. The days blurred into one another, with no sign of Hiro. The long-held hope that he might be among the survivors of the war began to dwindle with each passing day. Akiyo's fear for her son's safety intensified, but it was not the only emotion she battled. Alongside the fear was a deepening sense of hopelessness, as though the war was swallowing everything she had once known and loved. Her once quiet house now felt like a prison, and the waiting was slowly eating away at her soul. Then, one afternoon, the sounds of planes filled the sky, their engines roaring as they flew overhead. The people in the village froze, their faces a mixture of terror and anticipation. The Americans had arrived. The moment they had all been fearing had come to pass. Akiyo, standing at the window, could see the distant smoke rising from the hills where the Americans had landed. There was no longer any hiding from the inevitable. The first American soldiers to enter the village were met with an almost deafening silence. The villagers, who had been told to fear these men, now watched them approach with eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Akiyo, like the others, had been taught that these soldiers were monsters, cruel, heartless creatures who would destroy everything in their path. But as she watched them move cautiously through the village, a strange sensation began to form in her chest. They were not what she had imagined. The soldiers wore heavy gear, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the village with the sharp focus of men accustomed to the horrors of war. But there was something else in their expressions too, tiredness perhaps, or maybe even a trace of compassion. It was hard for Akiyo to tell. The images of monstrous invaders that had been drilled into her mind began to crack, replaced by the realization that these men too were caught in the same nightmare as the villagers. Akiyo's heart raced as she watched them pass by her home. They did not appear to be the ruthless killers she had been led to believe. They were soldiers, yes, but there was no violence in their movements, no anger or bloodlust. They moved with precision and caution, their rifles held steady, but their eyes scanning for threats, not civilians. Akiyo felt a strange dissonance, her entire worldview shifting in a single moment. Could it be possible that the enemy was not as she had been taught? Could it be that there was humanity even in the heart of war? As night fell, the sounds of the American soldiers' movements became distant, replaced by the crackle of radios and hushed conversations in the streets. Akiyo could not sleep. Her mind raced, torn between the overwhelming desire to see her son again and the creeping fear that she would never see him alive. She had heard rumors that the American forces were gathering children, taking them to safety in the camps set up behind their lines, but she knew the risks of trying to reach them. The soldiers were moving quickly, and the last thing Akiyo wanted was to be caught out in the open. The next day, Akiyo made a decision. She could no longer sit idly by, waiting for something to happen. The war had taken everything from her: her husband, her peace of mind, her son, and now it threatened to take her hope as well. If Hiro was alive, there was a chance she could find him. She would have to face the soldiers, to risk everything, but the possibility of seeing her child again was worth any danger. With trembling hands, she gathered what little she had left: her family's precious heirlooms, a few pieces of clothing, and a small token of her husband's memory, and set out. The journey was not easy. Akiyo had to be cautious, moving quietly and staying out of sight. As she walked through the village, now a place of ruin and uncertainty, she couldn't help but notice the signs of devastation everywhere. The once beautiful homes were now destroyed, and the fields that had fed their families were now empty, scorched by the violence of the war. Yet Akiyo pressed on, the thought of Hiro pushing her forward. She had no idea where to start looking, but she had to believe that he was still out there, somewhere. Every step she took was heavy with fear, but also with a kind of quiet determination. She was no longer the woman who had sat idly in her home, waiting for news. She was now a mother on a mission. Nothing else mattered except finding Hiro. The sound of American soldiers in the distance reminded her of the risk, but it also fueled her resolve. If she could just find a way to reach them, to find out where they were taking the children, there was a chance, just a chance, that she could bring her son back. And so, with the sun setting on another uncertain day, Akiyo set out into the unknown, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Akiyo's journey through the village felt like walking through a nightmare. The once familiar landscape, now scarred by the ravages of war, seemed both foreign and haunting. As she moved cautiously through the wreckage, her heart pounded in her chest, each step a mix of fear and determination. She had been told that the American soldiers were merciless, but as she ventured deeper into their occupied territory, she could see no signs of the violence she had been warned about. The village, once a vibrant community, was now eerily silent, except for the occasional distant voice or the rumbling of a jeep. It wasn't long before Akiyo realized that the rumors of the American forces capturing children and sending them to safety were not entirely false. She had overheard soldiers speaking of evacuees, of children being transported to safer areas behind their lines. She clung to this information like a lifeline, her hope swelling in her chest. If there was a chance to find her son among those children, then she had to take it, no matter the risk. The road to the American camp was not easy to navigate. Akiyo had to be careful, constantly staying in the shadows and avoiding the patrolling soldiers. Every sound, every rustling leaf made her freeze in place, her heart racing. She had no idea how the soldiers would react if they saw her. Would they shoot her on sight? Would they simply push her away, as they had done with so many others? The fear of the unknown clung to her like a second skin, but she couldn't stop. Hiro was somewhere out there, and she had to find him. As she neared the camp, Akiyo's resolve wavered. She had never been this close to the enemy, and the sight of the American soldiers, their uniforms crisp and their weapons at the ready, made her hesitate. She had been taught all her life to fear them, to believe that they were monsters who would show no mercy. Yet now, standing so close to them, she wondered if she could continue to see them as the enemy. They were just men, like her own husband had been, a husband who had gone off to fight and never returned. Akiyo's fear was not only for her own life, but for Hiro. She had no way of knowing if he was still alive, or if he had been taken far away, out of reach. But as the camp came into view, she saw something that made her pause. A group of children, some sitting in the dirt, others huddled together under the watchful eyes of a few soldiers. Her heart skipped a beat. Could Hiro be among them? The moment she stepped closer, Akiyo felt her anxiety intensify. There were more soldiers now, patrolling the camp's perimeter. If she was caught, she knew she would be arrested or worse. The thought of being taken away and never seeing her son again almost overwhelmed her. But she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, and the sight of the children gave her the strength she needed to keep moving forward. Akiyo's eyes scanned the faces of the children, her breath catching with each child she passed. None of them were Hiro. Her heart sank, and she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't afford to break down. She had to keep searching, to keep moving. As she continued down the line of children, she finally caught sight of a small figure, sitting alone in the dirt. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed distant, lost. Her pulse quickened. Could it be him? She stepped closer, her body trembling with a mix of fear and hope. The boy looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Akiyo's heart stopped. It was Hiro. He had grown thinner, his clothes were ragged, but it was unmistakably him. Her son. He was alive. She wanted to rush to him, to pull him into her arms, but she knew the danger of drawing attention. Instead, she crouched beside him, her voice barely a whisper as she called his name. "Hiro," she said softly, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Hiro looked up at her, his expression blank for a moment, as though he didn't recognize her. Then, as if the fog of confusion lifted, his eyes filled with recognition, and he flinched back, his body tensing in fear. Akiyo's heart broke as she saw the look of terror in his eyes. He had been taught to fear these soldiers, just as she had, and now he was terrified that his mother had become one of them. Akiyo knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act quickly before anyone noticed her. She pulled her son into a tight embrace, whispering words of comfort as she held him close. Hiro trembled in her arms, his small body shaking with the fear of what might happen next. Akiyo's mind raced, knowing that she couldn't stay there much longer. The soldiers were close, and if they discovered her, it would be over. With one last glance at the camp, Akiyo pulled Hiro to his feet. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. She didn't know how they would survive, or where they would go, but she couldn't risk waiting any longer. Her only focus was getting Hiro to safety, away from the soldiers and the war that had taken so much from them both. The risk was great, but it was nothing compared to the risk of losing her son again. Akiyo and Hiro began to move quickly, their footsteps light but hurried as they slipped away from the camp. Each moment felt like a lifetime, the danger of being caught looming over them. Akiyo's heart raced, but she kept her focus, determined to keep moving forward. They had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let anything stop them now. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months she felt a glimmer of hope. She had found Hiro, and together they would find a way out of this nightmare. Akiyo and Hiro moved swiftly through the underbrush, their footsteps muffled by the thick foliage. The dense jungle surrounding the American camp provided some cover, but every crack of a twig underfoot made Akiyo's heart race. She held Hiro's hand tightly, her grip firm yet gentle, as though she could protect him from everything that had happened and everything yet to come. The moment they stepped out from the camp, she felt a sense of urgency, a stark reminder of the danger they were in. The soldiers had no reason to let them go, and the thought of being caught was enough to send a wave of terror through her. The path ahead was unclear. They had no map, no plan other than the instinct to survive. Akiyo's thoughts constantly returned to the soldiers. What if they noticed them slipping away? What if someone saw them and gave chase? The fear that gripped her was a constant undercurrent to every movement. She couldn't afford to be careless, couldn't let her guard down for even a moment. But her exhaustion was mounting. The weight of the past days, the hunger, the uncertainty, all of it pressed on her like a heavy cloak. As they navigated through the dense forest, Hiro stumbled, his body weak from the long days without proper food. Akiyo stopped instantly, her heart aching as she looked down at him. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and his clothes were dirty and torn. It had only been a few days since they had last seen each other, but in that short time, the war had already taken its toll on him. Akiyo knelt down beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead, her heart breaking at how fragile he looked. "Just a little further, Hiro," she whispered, her voice soft and steady, trying to reassure him. "We'll rest soon, I promise." Hiro nodded, his eyes filled with both fear and trust. He didn't speak, but Akiyo could see the weight of his own burden in the way he moved. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that held him back. It was the emotional toll of everything he had endured. Akiyo knew he had witnessed things no child should have to see, things she couldn't protect him from. She only hoped that by some miracle they could escape this hell together. They continued moving, cautiously and quietly, as the sounds of war faded into the distance. The American soldiers, once so close, were now far behind, but the danger still lurked nearby. Every rustle in the trees, every distant echo of gunfire, made Akiyo freeze. The forest around them seemed alive, both a sanctuary and a prison. It offered the cover they needed, but also the looming threat of being trapped. Akiyo didn't know where they were heading, or if there would be another village, another place of refuge waiting for them. The only thing she knew was that she had to keep going. Hours passed, and Akiyo could feel the weight of their journey taking its toll. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ground as the forest grew darker. They hadn't stopped for rest, there was no time to waste. But now, as the light began to fade, Akiyo realized they needed shelter. She glanced around, searching for a place where they could hide for the night. Her eyes landed on a small cave, partially hidden by overgrown vines. It wasn't much, but it would provide the cover they needed for now. "Let's rest here for a while," Akiyo said, her voice tinged with relief. She led Hiro into the cave, her steps cautious as she glanced over her shoulder, making sure they weren't being followed. Once inside, she sat on the cold ground, her body aching from the long hours of walking. Hiro collapsed beside her, his small body trembling from exhaustion. Akiyo pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him to offer what little warmth she could. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the distant calls of animals in the night and the soft rustling of leaves outside. Akiyo stared into the darkness, her thoughts swirling. She had never felt so lost, so powerless. Yet, in this moment, with her son beside her, she also felt a flicker of hope. She had come this far. Surely they could make it through the rest. But even as she held Hiro, the fear remained. She could not shake the feeling that danger was always just a step behind them. She wondered if the soldiers would search the area, if they would find them here. The thought of being caught, of being dragged back to the village, was unbearable. Akiyo had to keep moving, but for now, they needed to rest, to regain some strength before they could continue their flight. As Hiro drifted into a fitful sleep in her arms, Akiyo's mind raced. Tomorrow, they would have to leave the cave and find a way to move deeper into the jungle. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Akiyo knew that the longer they remained hidden, the greater the risk. She closed her eyes for a moment, her body aching, but sleep didn't come. Instead, her thoughts turned to her husband, to the life they had once shared before the war had stolen everything from them. She couldn't allow herself to give in to despair. For Hiro, she had to keep fighting. The night passed slowly, and with the first light of dawn, Akiyo gently shook Hiro awake. The sounds of the jungle were quiet now, as if even the world was holding its breath. She knew they had to move again. Time was not on their side. The journey ahead was uncertain, the danger ever present. But Akiyo refused to let fear stop her. For Hiro, she would do whatever it took. The war may have taken everything, but it would not take her son. Not if she had anything to say about it. As the days dragged on, Akiyo and Hiro continued their precarious journey through the jungle. The dense foliage seemed endless, with no clear path to follow. Each day felt like an eternity, the heat pressing down on them, the constant fear of discovery lingering in the back of Akiyo's mind. Hiro's energy was dwindling, and Akiyo could see how weak he had become. His once bright eyes were now dull, his body too thin, and his strength fading with each step. Akiyo's heart ached for him. She wished she could give him more than just hope. The jungle, while providing them with shelter, also held its own set of dangers. Akiyo knew they had to keep moving, to stay ahead of the soldiers who might be searching the area for stragglers. She had no idea how far they were from any sort of civilization, or how much longer they could survive like this. The scarcity of food was becoming more pressing, and her own hunger began to gnaw at her. Every time she thought of stopping, Hiro's weak voice urging her to keep going was enough to push her forward. He needed her, and she would not let him down. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the trees, sending a chill through Akiyo's spine. She froze, her heart racing. Had the soldiers found them? Were they closing in? The thought of being discovered now was too much to bear. They had come so far, only to be caught at the final moment. Akiyo quickly pulled Hiro behind a thick cluster of trees, crouching low to the ground. They remained perfectly still, holding their breath, as the sounds of gunfire grew louder. Akiyo's pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel Hiro's small body trembling next to hers. The gunfire eventually faded, but Akiyo knew it was only a matter of time before the soldiers reached their position. They couldn't stay here much longer. Akiyo's mind raced with thoughts of where they could go next, but the jungle seemed endless, and every direction felt like a dead end. The only option, she realized, was to keep moving, no matter how much it exhausted them both. The more time they spent hiding, the closer they came to being found. That evening, as the sun began to set and the jungle around them grew darker, Akiyo noticed something in the distance, small lights flickering like distant stars. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Could it be a village? A small settlement, perhaps, or an American outpost? The idea seemed too good to be true, yet something deep inside her stirred with the possibility. She grabbed Hiro's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The light was a beacon, a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness that had surrounded them for so long. With renewed determination, Akiyo guided Hiro toward the light. She moved carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible, keeping her body low to the ground. The dense underbrush made it difficult to move quickly, but Akiyo was driven by the thought that this could be their chance, their one opportunity to escape this nightmare. Hiro, though exhausted, followed her without question. He had learned to trust her completely, and, in his eyes, Akiyo saw a quiet strength that matched her own. As they drew closer, the sound of voices became faintly audible. Akiyo's heart raced faster, the anticipation and fear battling for dominance inside her. Was this a safe place, or was it another trap? She couldn't be sure. But the hope that this could be the moment they had been waiting for was too strong to ignore. She had to take the risk. When they finally reached the edge of the settlement, Akiyo crouched low, peering through the trees at the small group of people gathered around a fire. She could see their faces, some of them weary, others more hopeful, as they spoke in hushed voices. They were not soldiers, Akiyo realized. These were civilians, other survivors just like her. A sudden wave of relief washed over her. She had found others who had endured the same horrors, who had made it through the war just like she had. Akiyo hesitated, unsure of what to do next. She could see the village was struggling, much like her own, with the weight of war's aftermath. Yet, in that moment, she knew she had to take the chance. She stood up slowly, still holding Hiro's hand tightly, and approached the group. Her steps were slow but deliberate, each movement filled with the hope that this was not a mistake. The group noticed them immediately. Some of the villagers looked at them with curiosity, while others seemed guarded, unsure of whether to trust these strangers. Akiyo felt a wave of uncertainty rush over her. But then a woman stepped forward, her expression softening as she saw the child in Akiyo's arms. She recognized the desperation in Akiyo's eyes, the same look that had been in her own eyes just days before. With a gentle smile, the woman spoke, her voice warm despite the situation. "You are safe here," she said, her words a balm to Akiyo's worried heart. "We are survivors, just like you. We'll help you." Akiyo felt tears welling in her eyes as she stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say anything more. All the fear, the pain, the struggle of the past days seemed to melt away in that moment. They were not alone anymore. They had found people who understood, who would help them. As the woman led them into the small settlement, Akiyo felt a sense of hope rising within her for the first time in weeks. She had made it. They had made it. The war was far from over, but for now at least, they were safe. And that was enough. The village was small, tucked away among the thick trees of the jungle, and although it had seen its fair share of hardship, there was a sense of resilience here that Akiyo had not felt in months. As they were led through the narrow pathways, she could see the makeshift homes, built from salvaged materials, each one a testament to the survivors' determination to rebuild their lives. The people here were tired, their faces worn with the weight of loss, but there was a quiet strength in their eyes, a shared understanding that they had all been through the worst of it and had somehow made it to the other side. The woman who had greeted them introduced herself as Mai, a mother and one of the few remaining leaders of the village. She explained that, like Akiyo, many of the villagers had lost everything during the war. Some had lost children, others had lost husbands, and some had even lost their homes to the bombings. But they had survived, and they had come together to create a community where they could heal and rebuild. There was no more talk of the enemy, no more fear of what had been, only the quiet acceptance of what was left and the will to move forward. Akiyo and Hiro were offered food, something Akiyo hadn't had a proper meal of in days. She watched as Hiro ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a rare treasure. It broke Akiyo's heart to see him so frail, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of relief. He was alive. He was here, with her. They were safe, at least for now. The hunger, the fear, the desperation, they were all behind them, replaced by a kind of quiet peace that seemed almost too good to be true. That evening, as the village gathered around a small fire, Akiyo sat with Hiro in her lap, wrapped in a blanket that had been given to them by one of the villagers. The air was cooler than it had been in days, and the firelight flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on the ground. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of what had happened during the war, how they had survived, and how they had come to this place of fragile hope. Akiyo listened intently, her heart swelling with both gratitude and sorrow. These people had known pain, loss, and fear just as she had, and yet here they were, still holding on. Mai, sitting beside Akiyo, began to speak of the future. The village was rebuilding slowly, but the road ahead was uncertain. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. Akiyo felt a lump form in her throat as Mai spoke. It was the first time in a long while that Akiyo had allowed herself to think about the future. For so long, she had only focused on surviving the present, on keeping Hiro safe. But now, in this small village, surrounded by strangers who had become friends, she realized that survival wasn't enough. They needed to build something more, a future where Hiro could grow up in peace. A future where the horrors of the past could slowly fade into memory. As the night wore on, the fire began to dwindle, and the villagers slowly dispersed to their homes. Akiyo stayed by the fire, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She didn't know how long they would stay in the village, or what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. Hiro, exhausted from the day's events, had fallen asleep in her arms, his small body nestled against hers. She looked down at him, his face peaceful for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She couldn't protect him from the world, but she could protect him from the fear that had ruled their lives for so long. The village may have been small, but it was a place of refuge. Akiyo knew that they would have to work hard to build a future here, just as the other villagers had done. They would have to grow their own food, rebuild their homes, and create new lives from the ashes of the old. But that was something Akiyo was willing to fight for. She would not let Hiro's childhood be defined by war and loss. She would make sure that, no matter how long it took, he would grow up in a world where hope wasn't just a distant dream, but a real possibility. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered above, Akiyo finally allowed herself to close her eyes. She didn't know what the future held, but she had Hiro, and that was enough. They had made it through the worst of it, and now, with the support of this new community, they could start again. The journey had been long and difficult, but in that quiet moment, as the village settled into sleep, Akiyo realized that she had found something worth fighting for, a future where she and Hiro could finally heal together.